Right guys, today I want to delve into some pretty interesting iPad rumors I've heard about recently that has got me a little confused, and that begins with the iPad 10 because yes, before the release of the iPad 9, we have rumors about the iPad 10, and they don't make a ton of sense in my opinion. So according to Alex and Apple Lab on Twitter, they've come up with some renders of the iPad 10 based on what they've heard, and basically it's an iPad Air with a slightly smaller 10.6-inch display. Now obviously I would love to see the newer design of the iPad Pro and the iPad Air come over to the budget iPad because for around $300 that newer design and newer specs would be a pretty insane deal. But it also makes no sense whatsoever, and let me delve into why. So the first reason is the upgrade cycle Apple has with the budget iPad. So when Apple introduces a new design to the budget iPads, it stays around for at least 2 years. For example, the iPad 5 incorporated the iPad Air 1's design, and then that was carried over to the iPad 6 with a newer chip. And then eventually we saw a redesign with the iPad 7 with a slightly bigger 10.2-inch display, and that was carried over to the iPad 8, which has the same design, but with a newer chip. And so of course, going by the upgrade cycle, the iPad 9 gets the iPad Air 3/iPad Pro 10.5 inches design, and that should stay around for the iPad 10 with a newer SoC. And so yes, I don't see this redesign happening for a minimum of 2 years, and so the iPad 10 should be pretty much identical to the iPad 9 in terms of design. But I do also have another point, and that is, the iPad 10, if it were to get this Pro redesign, would instantly kill the iPad Air, because honestly, what difference would there be between the iPad Air and this iPad 10 if it were to get the Pro redesign? Because apart from the slightly smaller display on the iPad 10, it would still have Touch ID, all the colors, Apple Pencil support, the same bezel-less display, and so yeah, that would make the iPad Air redundant. And so really it comes down to this: when the iPad Air gets another redesign, maybe incorporating the current 11-inch design with the dual cameras, that's when the current iPad Air design will come over to the budget iPad. And well, the iPad Air getting a redesign depends on when the iPad Pro gets a redesign. So you can start to understand why I think the base iPad won't be getting a major redesign anytime soon. So yes, if you're waiting for the iPad 9, I would still suggest you get that, and not wait for the iPad 10 because I'm pretty sure it won't be this drastic of an upgrade. Anyways, moving on to the next iffy report that does have a little more credibility behind it, and that is OLED is coming to the iPad Air. So this isn't particularly any new info because you might remember Min-Chi Kuo, a supply chain expert, did say the next generation iPad Air would gain OLED a few weeks ago, and well, this made no sense to me back then, and it still makes no sense to me because OLED is still superior to Mini LED and LCD, and so why would they include that with the iPad Air instead of the iPad Pro? In fact, to make things worse, the iPad Air would have OLED, and the 11-inch Pro, which is $200 more, will continue to have LCD, which doesn't make a ton of sense. Now obviously I did dismiss the initial reports, but now we have Korean sources saying that Samsung and LG, which are Apple's OLED suppliers, have started prepping OLED displays for iPads that could be launching next year. Now I am mostly still confused about this report, but I have been doing some research, and maybe there is a possibility where this actually could make some sense. So number one, Min-Chi Kuo in his initial report did say this OLED display would be a more rigid form, and I'm not sure what exactly that means, but I'm assuming that means it's going to be slightly worse than the OLEDs we get on the iPhones, and so maybe that does mean that somehow this OLED display will still be worse than the LCD and the Mini LED we see on the iPad Pro. However, what I think is more likely is that we see OLED on the next generation iPad Pros. So I will say that initially, this might not make a ton of sense because Apple's incorporating Mini LED across the iPad and Mac range, and so why would they go through the hassle of developing Mini LED products if they were ditching it for OLED within the next year? Well, I do think Mini LED will continue to exist on the Mac side, especially the bigger Macs, because Obviously, larger OLED displays are more susceptible to burn-in, and so mini LED would still be the best thing to use for the Macs. However, that's not really the case with the iPad range since they have much smaller displays, but that does still beg the question, why did Apple use mini LED on this year's iPad Pro? Well, I can think of two reasons. Maybe mini LED was something Apple was experimenting with, and so that's why they only gave it to us on the 12.9-inch iPad Pro. But I think more importantly, Samsung and LG, which are Apple's display suppliers, simply did not have the capacity to make 120Hz LTPO displays on the scale Apple needs. This was an issue Apple had to face last year because the iPhone 12 Pro series was supposed to have 120Hz support, but Samsung and LG just could not produce LTPO displays on the scale Apple needs because obviously Apple sells way more iPhones and iPads than the rest of the competition. However, because the iPad Air has no 120Hz, it does not need the LTPO tech, and so that's likely why the iPad Air is getting OLED first. And so coming back to my main point, if Apple were to give us OLED on the iPad Air by 2022, I am pretty sure the iPad Pro will follow suit, since we should see the new iPad Pros at the end of next year if they were to stick with their regular schedule. And by the way, this isn't just a crazy theory because there are rumors that have suggested in the past that we should see OLED iPad Pros in 2022. And also I have heard from a source that Apple is currently testing 12-inch iPad Pros, and so maybe with the use of OLED, Apple can shrink the bezels and actually give us a redesign of some sort. Anyways, thank you for watching, make sure to like and subscribe. For the latest Apple news and rumors, check out the video in the icon above about the WWDC hardware releases we can expect. And on that note, I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya, peeps!